Welcome to John Redmann, Power of Attorney, the show that aims to empower you through knowledge of the law. I'm Attorney John Redmann. Shauna Sanford is out on assignment and can't be with us today. This week, we're continuing our discussion about legal aid and assistance. Mark Moreau, Director of the Southeast Louisiana Legal Services, joins us again this week to talk about the various ways that Southeast Louisiana Legal Services can help those who can't afford legal counsel in civil cases. Mark Moreau has been the Director of Southeast Louisiana Legal Services for more than 20 years. Mark, thanks again for being with us for this continuing discussion on this very important topic. We're going to plunge right in and get into some of the weeds. We want to get into more detail. The last episode, we covered more broadly what Southeast Louisiana Legal Services does, how you qualify, and a lot of those details. Let's get into some of the different areas of law. You ready to have that discussion?
Sure.
Okay, good. One of the big categories, as I understand it, is landlord tenant. People, and I hear it all the time, you rented an apartment, you thought it was going to be a nice place to live, you start having all kinds of issues, plumbing issues, heating issues, and then the landlord doesn't want to fix it, or the landlord's jacking up the rent on you, all these different things. Is that in the area of landlord tenant that you deal with in Southeast Louisiana Legal Services?
Yes, that's an area that we deal with, but with the impending funding cuts, we'll probably have to cut back to representing mostly Section 8 and public housing tenants who face loss of their housing through eviction or termination of their subsidy. Our housing unit has gone down from 8 lawyers to 3 lawyers in the last year because of various funding cuts.
Oh, gosh.
And so it's really affected the range of work that we can do in that area.
Okay,
and,
so let's talk about
security deposits. We're still doing that. A lot of landlords refuse to return the security deposits.
All right, well,
and eviction defense and subsidy termination. Can I get out of my lease? Another big area is the Protecting Tenants from Foreclosure Act. This is a new federal law where if the apartment complex gets foreclosed on, the tenants are generally going to have a right to stay there for at least 90 days, even if they didn't have a recorded lease. Sometimes those rights get ignored by the bank or the seizing creditor. But it's a good, strong law, and we've made use of it.
It's a federal law, right?
It's a federal law.
And what that means is typically if you rent a place to live,
Mm-hmm.
and you have that lease with the landlord, to be most protected if you record that lease, that means if somebody else were to purchase that building that you're in, that apartment complex or whatever, that recorded lease forces the next purchaser of the property to honor that lease.
That's correct.
But most people who rent an apartment, they're not going to spend the money, and I think it might be a couple $100s to record your lease downtown in New Orleans or West Bank if you're Jefferson Parish. Nobody ever thinks to do that. If you've never done that and somebody sells that apartment complex and they're going to demolish it and put up a shopping mall or something, this gives them some relief from being evicted very quickly and gives them 90 days, you said?
At least 90 days.
At least 90
Even
days.
if they have an oral lease or an unrecorded lease. If it's a situation where the bank is foreclosing on the landlord owner, the tenants are going to get protected for at least 90 days.
And foreclosure is probably a more typical example as opposed to
rather
the
than
owner
demolition.
just selling it for demolition or other purposes. Okay. Well, you mentioned that because of cuts, you're not going to be able to help with all the various issues that come up between tenants and landlords, but at least some of the very common issues like getting your rent deposit back, you're still able to help with that?
We're still able to help with that, and we use volunteer attorneys and law school clinics and pro bono attorneys. In addition to our own staff, we have like 3 major pro bono projects throughout our service area. Generally, in New Orleans, it's the Pro Bono Project, and then in Baton Rouge, it's the Bar Association, and then on the North Shore, we have our own in-house pro bono project, and we try to use pro bono attorneys as effectively as we can, and security deposits is one area that they've had an interest in working in.
Fantastic.
Right.
And hats off to pro bono attorneys, and that's just a fancy Latin way of saying they work for free.
Right.
And they represent clients for free. Right.
And they do a good job.
Anything else in the, well, Section 8 housing, and why don't you just in a nutshell explain what that is and how those Section 8 renters are helped?
Well, Section 8 tenants it's subsidized by the federal government, so the rent's at a reasonable level, and then you have some protection from eviction, which often, if you're just a simple private tenant, you have very little protection other than what's in your lease. But if you're in public housing or Section 8, often they have to have what's called good cause to evict you.
Okay.
And often they don't have that cause, but they still want to evict you, and that's where we defend people. And we've been very successful at protecting people's rights to stay in Section 8 or public housing.
Fantastic.
A lot of these folks would be homeless if they got evicted from that type of housing.
Yeah, if you get evicted and you don't get your deposit back, suddenly most people live hand to mouth. They make just enough money to pay their bills and feed their family. Suddenly you got to come up with a new deposit in a new apartment complex or a new place to live. People don't have that money.
Yeah, they have $1,500 for the deposit and $1,500 for the first month rent, and
it could be devastating.
People are in a quandary.
Well, that's one reason we're so happy to have you here and salute you and say thank you for all you and all the pro bono attorneys and all the attorneys who work there, the work you're doing. All right, short on time, so let's go to the next category. There's a category called public benefits. What's that?
Public benefits is like Social Security and SSI disability, food stamps, and unemployment compensation primarily. We've also done work in FEMA and road homes since Katrina, which are technically public benefits.
Right, why don't you explain what kind of problems people come to you with that fit into those headings?
Well, usually they've been denied their food stamps, and then the question becomes whether they're really eligible or they've been given an amount lower than they were entitled to. Unemployment comp, the same thing. The employer opposes the unemployment comp, and then the question becomes...
Somebody stopped working somewhere.
Right.
They're applying for unemployment wage benefits, money to live on while they look for new work, and the employer says they should not receive those weekly benefits or those wage benefits.
Right, and then sometimes there's systemic issues like the state has a really arbitrary rule for determining when somebody qualifies for unemployment based on their wages. You have to have so many wages in a certain base period. And that law doesn't make sense anymore, so we're challenging that law, and hopefully our guy will get benefits and
Wonderful.
Anybody else in his situation.
Wonderful. Well, I know there's a lot more we can talk about in there, and if you feel like you fit in any of those categories, please get in touch with Southeast Louisiana Legal Services, and we'll have all their contact information on our website. But let's change gears. Another category is housing. We talked about landlord tenant, but housing is a sort of a different area of legal concerns. Why don't you tell us what else you do to help people with what you call housing issues?
Right, since Katrina, we've started representing more homeowners because so many homeowners were affected by Katrina, and often a lot of people lost their property to tax sales without ever getting notice. So we help people get their property back from a tax sale.
Fantastic.
We have been doing some work with blight, but we're going to have to eliminate that. That's hard to really work in.
Goodness.
There are some co-ownership interests, I'm a co-owner, what can I do to repair my home? They have a fight with their co-owner, that type of thing.
So two people own a piece of property together, but they can't agree on sharing the costs of the repairs that are needed or whether or not they're needed. So you might get involved in trying to untangle that mess.
Yes, and another example might be a donation. Sometimes a grandmother will donate her property to the younger family members, and then retain a usufruct, what's called a usufruct, the right to use. But then they they try to get grandma out of the house.
Kick her out of the house
Get
she donated to.
Even
them?
though she
How's that for
retained
gratitude?
a right to use it for the rest of her life. So there are often disputes like that come up.
Okay.
So.
Again, there's so much to cover and there's not enough time. We mentioned in the earlier episode on this topic about what you do, family law, but family law is such a big topic and we've done episodes on it. Why don't you define some of the typical cases that family law includes that you guys assist people with?
Well, right now it's mostly divorce, custody, and family violence. We give a very high priority to anybody who's a family violence victim. We help them with a protective order. We establish interim spousal and child support and hopefully get them use of the home. And we want to regulate the custody thing so that there's safe custody arrangements and safe visitation.
Right. So kind of those are the main broad areas that help help divorces, get divorces through, arranging child custody and child visitation, and then who needs to pay how much for child support, and if money is owed from one spouse to the other in support.
Right. We normally don't do too much in the child support area because the state,
Gets involved in that.
is very involved in that and has a lot of lawyers, but we do child support if it's incidental to a domestic violence case. Also in the New Orleans area, there are a lot of what we call third-party custody actions where typically a grandma or an uncle is taking care of a child who's been neglected.
Right.
And they need a custody order to get the kid into school or just to be able to take care of that kid. That's a huge problem. A lot of the school systems insist on formal custody orders.
Right.
A lot of the housing authorities insist on formal custody orders. It's very difficult legal work to get that done. But for a lot of clients, if they don't get the custody order, then they're going to be denied the reasonably priced housing and they're going to be denied schooling.
Oh.
And that's quite a burden right now.
Well, obviously, we could talk more about that, but we're out of time for this segment. We're going to have to take a break. Coming up next, Mark and I will be answering your questions. Stick around, and we'll be right back.